we are going to proceed the first keynote speech. And our first speaker is Mr. Bertrand de la Chapelle. Mr. Bertrand is the Executive Director of our Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network. And the topic that he will be given is what governance for the global digital society. So now, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let's put our hands together to welcome Mr. Bertrand. Please.
Hello, everyone. I hope you're hearing me correctly.
Yes, please.
All right. So I will share a few slides. If you allow me, let me share my screen if I'm allowed to. That should be the case. And if I do this, do you see the right screen? Yes. Wonderful. So, first of all, thank you so much to allow me to be here. It's a real honor to talk to all of you. I am extremely sad not to be here in person due to personal constraints. I was really looking forward to participating in this event, and I'm glad to do it remotely nonetheless. What I want to talk about today is internet governance, but more broadly, governance in the digital age, because it is a challenge that concerns us all, and you are all practitioners of something that a lot of people in the world don't know or are not familiar with, which is a particular approach to governance that is bottom-up, that is multi-stakeholder, and that basically has driven the success of the internet from the onset. The success of the internet that allows it today to serve billions of people, and to be honest, that has allowed the internet to withstand the amazing stress test of the pandemic period, which basically was a period when we were all dependent completely on the internet to continue to work. You actually know that this multi-stakeholder approach works because you live it every day. And you also know that it is an approach, it's a method that is sometimes under pressure and that deserves to be defended. What I would like to do today with you is to invite you to step back for one moment and look at a larger picture. Because most of you remember the definition that was adopted of internet governance during the World Summit on the Information Society almost 20 years ago. You remember that it was the development and application of principles, norms, rules, decision-making procedures, et cetera, by the different stakeholders of shared regimes that shaped the evolution and use of the internet. And I'm known in this community for many years as for making a distinction between two different things, the governance of the internet and the governance on the internet. When you look at the general architecture, we have the basic physical layers that underpin the internet. But you have what is related to the evolution of the internet, which is basically the standards, the protocols, which can be called the governance of the internet. But there is also all the layers that deal with the applications, what we do with the internet, the uses of the internet. Let's call it the governance on the internet. And today I would like to focus more on the governance on the internet, mostly because the governance of the internet works, as I said. But the governance on the internet is a huge challenge because of the diversity of legal environments that apply, because of the lack of institutions. And that's one of the things that I want to discuss, because I like often to share the statement by Salman Rushdie, which says, only he who steps out of the frame can see the whole picture. And here, a little bit like you remember in 1968, Apollo 8 took the first picture of the Earth rising, seen from above the moon, which was a complete inversion of the perspective. And I think it was instrumental in triggering the understanding that the planet is a whole, is a complex system, and that it is fragile. And it was probably instrumental in understanding and triggering the awareness regarding the environmental challenges. Here, I want to do the same a little bit and invite you to get with me on a sort of voyage along an historic arc to look at the key question of how do we govern in the digital age in a larger scheme of things, not only the internet, but our societies. Because in a certain way, along with the climate crisis, this question of the digital governance or the governance of the digital age is basically one of the two fundamental existential questions that we're faced with. It is a question of institution because basically the internet and the digital revolution was launched about 50 years ago this year with the invention of the internet. And we all know that it is accelerating today with artificial intelligence. As an engineer, I find that absolutely exciting. But as a citizen, I wonder, I'm asking myself, will we be able to handle the transnational issues raised by the evolution of the digital age? Or will we be governed by technology? Are we going to lose the control of the trajectory of our societies, which is a concern that a lot of us have today? And I think it all depends upon the answer to one question, which is, do we have the right institutional instruments? Do we have the right tools to do this? And we need to talk about this because in all the debates, all the electoral competitions that we have in each of our countries, this is not an issue that is addressed as such, although it is absolutely essential for the trajectory of our societies and our digital future. For more than 20 years now, I've dedicated myself to those institutional challenges of the digital age. I served as the thematic ambassador in the French Foreign Affairs Ministry on those issues. I was, as many of you know, a director on the ICANN board a few years ago, and I co-founded 12 years ago the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network, and more recently another initiative called the DataSphere Initiative. And from those 20 years, I draw basically three convictions. The first one is that we are experiencing a really historic transition at the scale of the whole of humanity. The second thing is that the international system, the way it is today, is not sufficient to deal with the challenges raised by the digital era at the global level. And the third conviction is that therefore, we need a sort of paradigm shift towards a more networked governance architecture. I mentioned that I believe it is a historic transition. And when you look at the human species, unlike most other species, it is able to collaborate at a massive scale. And the internet is a perfect example of this capacity to collaborate at a massive scale. And this is due to our capacity as humans to innovate in the way we communicate, in the way we organize economically, and the way we organize our institutions. If you look at the internet, it is actually the fourth revolution in human communication after language, writing, and printing. And now, almost the entirety of humanity is connected in real time through this tool, which is unprecedented. Likewise, in the economic dimension, we started with being hunter-gatherers, and we have added agriculture and industry, and now the digital economy. And at each stage, there have been intense fights for the distribution of the value add that was created. And it will be the same for the digital economy, as we see in the artificial intelligence landscape at the moment, because the value added that is created by the digital economy is orders of magnitude larger than what was created by the Industrial Revolution. And so the fights are going to be important. In order to organize our societies, in the course of time, we have developed institutions. And each of those institutions were governance paradigms, because history, in a certain way, it's the constant effort of humanity to organize itself in communities that are more numerous, more extensive, and more interconnected. And this general march towards more complex structures usually was based, institutionally speaking, on very simple principles. In tribes, it was basically the reference to the elders in communities of a few hundreds or a few thousand people. Then we adopted more or less hereditary principles in ancient empires or in monarchies for a few million people. And now most of the countries in the world are using a mechanism of representation based on voting and citizenship for communities that can go up to more than 1 billion people in nation states. And today, the question is, the digital revolution and the AI revolution is bringing this at a massive scale of the entirety of humanity and the planet. And the challenge is, how can we organize the coexistence of billions of people sharing online spaces when those people live in cultural, political, religious, and legal environments that are so different? This is a real civilizational challenge. And furthermore, this adaptation is only beginning, and it is going to have to happen in decades, not in centuries or millennia, as in the past. Which leads to a key question. Do we have the right instruments to do this at the global scale? And unfortunately, the lesson from the last 20 years is, I'm afraid we don't. The international system doesn't provide the right tools the way it is today. The reason is relatively simple. While the technological revolution is constantly accelerating, our institutions are stuck in time. As a matter of fact, it's probably one of the few activities that have not been really impacted by the digital transformation. And I give you an example, an illustration. My grandfather, just my grandfather, was born in 1867, 16 years before the first commercial typewriter. If he were to come back today, he would be absolutely amazed by our mobile phones, the internet, artificial intelligence. But he would be completely at ease in most of our parliamentary processes and our diplomatic environments, because the codes haven't changed in 150 years. The current international system is finding its roots, basically, historically, more than 400 years ago from the treaties of Westphalia and the concept of nation states. It is based on a patchwork of 119 nation states with territorially defined sovereignties, jealously defended. And it was designed, this system, in a world with relatively few countries, most of which were still colonial, and in an environment where there was relatively little, or at least much fewer interactions across borders between individual entities or companies. And the main purpose was to prevent the return of war. Unfortunately, we see that it's not even working for that. But the point I want to make is this international system today is very badly adapted to our interconnected societies, where the key issue is cooperation to deal with transnational issues and not only international issues. And that's a very important distinction, because humanity is not just a collection of nation states. It's extremely, it's a reduction, it's a simplification. Humanity actually is a network of networks. There are billions of structures of all sorts that organize our interactions. Families, cultural interactions, professional interactions, political interactions, religious ones, etc. And those organizations, they can be public or private, they can be formal or informal, they can be for-profit or not. They all have their own mechanism of organization, and this creates an extremely complex mesh, something that in mathematical terms can be called a hypergraph. And this very rich and complex structure of humanity and organization of humanity is absolutely not reflected by the international system the way it is. Because this international system is pyramidal, it is hierarchical, it's pretty rigid, and most importantly, it is based, when you think about it, on one single criteria that underpins everything: citizenship. Everything is connected to the nationality of individuals. It means that the governments, through their ambassadors, and I've been one of them, have the monopoly of representation of their citizens at a global level. And most importantly, this is a system that structurally does not include or even excludes a lot of entities, private and civil society, that are necessary to understand the different dimensions of a problem and work on the solutions. To share a personal experience, in 2001, my life literally changed because of an initiative of Japan in the context of the G8. I was a French diplomat for about 15 years then, quite frustrated with the functioning of the international system already. And I participated for the first time in a group called the DOT Force, Digital Opportunities Task Force, which brought together on an equal footing governments, businesses, and civil society. And I must say it was a revelation, so much so that I spent the following 20 years exploring, experimenting, and promoting this new approach that you know very well, but that is not frequent in other environments, which is based on a notion of stakeholdership. Because I believe very strongly that building those bridges between the different stakeholders and bringing them together is what is needed to develop the governance that we need in this new interconnected age. And that means in particular that we need to overcome the antagonism between governments and private sector and civil society, because they do have a joint responsibility. They have a duty of cooperation. And sometimes the physical setting of a room, like the one we adopt for the events of the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network, show almost symbolically that these actors have problems in common and not only problems with each other, that they have a shared responsibility to work together in a networked way on an issue-by-issue basis to find the solution and to implement the solution together. And one of the fundamental reasons why we need a multi-stakeholder approach is because in most cases, decisions have to be implemented by a range of actors and not only the ones who adopt the norms. And that means that, in a nutshell, there is one message that I'm trying to spread around the world, which is that our networked society needs networked governance. It's as simple as that. Our humanity, our networked humanity, needs network governance. And in order to achieve this network governance, the most natural thing is to take inspiration from the very network of networks that we all know very well, the internet, and what made its success. So I don't have to explain to you how the internet works. It is something that I sometimes have to do elsewhere, but I want to go quickly through a parallel that makes you understand better what I mean by network governance. We all know that the internet is a range of heterogeneous communication networks interconnected without changing their structure through a protocol that creates the global internet. The analogy I want to draw here is that likewise, for the general question of governance, we have an enormous range of heterogeneous human structures. They can be public authorities, they can be companies, academia, technical community, of which you are largely, and civil society groups. And the challenge, I believe, today is for us to develop a cooperation protocol that allows those heterogeneous governance structures, each with their own ways to organize, to become interoperable and to create a governance network that allows to address the issues that we have in common. This inspiration is a very important element because it means moving from an architecture that is today based fundamentally exclusively on territories and citizenship to a mechanism and an architecture that is organized by thematic networks and stakeholders' involvement. And so this fundamentally is a paradigm shift. For those of you who know the work of Thomas Kuhn with the structure of scientific revolutions, this is the moment where we understand that the system currently is in crisis and we're looking for an alternative. But this paradigm shift, this change, is a respectful one because it is actually something that doesn't replace the existing structures. Quite on the contrary, it is a way to weave them together, to complement them, to put them in a network of cooperation to address their different problems. This means that the authority of governments remains completely as it is for everything that is limited to their own territory. It means that the intergovernmental organizations remain perfectly appropriate when we talk about relations between states. But when the issues and the challenges are transnational and not only international, and more importantly, when the solution to problems requires that the decisions of a government have impact on the territory of another state, then the range of responsibilities is changing. And sovereignty remains absolutely a fundamental principle, but it cannot be an absolute one. There are responsibilities attached to the behavior of governments when they elaborate regulations that have extraterritorial impact. And likewise, most of those issues regarding the digital era require the participation of other stakeholders. One point that I'm extremely happy to make here, that I make in other environments, but that is particularly relevant here, is that this paradigm shift is not only about governing the digital sector, it's also enabled by the digital sector, because there are new tools for participation, for consultation, that will enable this new era of democracy in models that we have not invented completely yet, but it's a particular pleasure to talk about it here for something that is taking place in Taiwan. And it's one of the reasons why I'm so frustrated not to be able to be present in person, given the work that is done by Audrey Tang in the Taiwanese government. But I think it's important for us to understand that when we talk about internet governance and the governance of the digital sector, we're also talking about digitally enabled governance and governance for the digital age, democracy on a global scale. To finish, I want to highlight just one thing, that we need to think in terms of systems. And when you look at the climate crisis, we talk about the atmosphere, the biosphere, the hydrosphere, and all of these are complex dynamic systems. And we have learned, unfortunately, that the activities of humanity as a whole and our individual activities impact those spheres. What is interesting is that this digital revolution that is accelerating has created, I believe, a new sphere. Let's call it the data sphere. And this data sphere is basically composed of the enormous quantity of data that we're producing on a minute basis, but also all the individuals, the groups, and the systems that produce, collect, process, and use this data, and all the norms, public and private, that apply to those interactions. And this data sphere is also a complex adaptive system. Every single of our actions, individually or collectively, every structures or decision we make in technology or in legal dimensions actually impact the trajectory of this data sphere and the trajectory of our general society, for better or worse. It either triggers cooperation, like when we do the internet or build the internet, or when we create Wikipedia, but it can also create the polarization that we see as a result of our use of social media and the political tensions that come from it. The behavior of each of us matter. And the major challenge that we have when we talk about governance and digital governance, it's how will we guide the trajectory of this complex system of the data sphere in what I call, sometimes jokingly, the Goldilocks zone. You know the story of Goldilocks and the three bears, with the bowl of soups that are too hot, too cold, or just right. A lot of the regulatory decisions that we have to make, a lot of the mechanisms for governance that we want to build should be conceived in order to define this Goldilocks zone between two extremes, because in most cases, we are presented with a very binary alternative. And very often the question is, how do you reconcile competing interests rather than choosing or arbitrating between one and the other? So we have the power to choose our collective destiny, and there is one underlying question that I want to leave you with, which is, what is the digital society that we want to build? Is it one that will continue to foster tensions, polarizations, inequalities, or one that, on the contrary, will use those new tools to foster cooperation or self-determination and a more equitable distribution of the value. I mentioned my grandfather at the beginning of this presentation. I now have my first grandson, who is 2 months old, and basically the world he will live in is being decided now. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Elinor Ostrom, who was the Nobel Prize in economics. And she basically encouraged us to develop political institutions that bring out the best in humans. And she even thought that it was the key purpose of politics was to develop those institutions that align the incentives. And her work was a testimony to that. I think it is our duty today to think around those institutional elements. And I hope that in this keynote, I have convinced you of the importance of those institutional dimensions, of addressing the tools with which we discuss the policy issues, because it is a topic that is not sufficiently discussed, a sort of meta topic. And I hope also that I've reassured you a little bit in our capacity to develop certainly not a global government or a world government, and even less some sort of super directorate of a few states or a few big private actors, but our capacity to develop a governance architecture at the global level that reflects more faithfully the connected nature of humanity. I know it is pretty easy to despair in the current environment of geopolitical tensions, but there was somebody in Europe called Jean Monnet, who was the creator and the initiator of the European Union, and he said, "I'm not optimistic, I'm determined." And I think that's the message that I would like to leave with you, because we are in an environment where a lot of discussions are taking place at the moment around what should be the global architecture for digital issues. There will be a summit for the future, there will be a GDC, there are discussions around the IGF, the WSIS plus 20. The next 2 years are going to be extremely important. And it is extremely important as well that the community that is making the internet work not only shares how it functions, not only advocates for a way to be inclusive and multi-stakeholder, but also shares the desire to be, as Kofi Annan was inviting us to do back in 2004, to be in institutional matters as innovative as the people who invented the internet in the first place. I will be leaving in a few days for a meeting in Brazil called Net Mundial. And I think this is a place where we will be discussing those things, and I hope to have the opportunity to discuss with you in the coming months and years about those very important issues. And I'm really happy to have had the opportunity to talk to you about this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bertrand. Thank you, Mr. Bertrand. So now we are proceeding. We are now open floor for our QA. So for our participants, if you have any question, please do not hesitate to stand in front of our microphone stand. Any questions from Mr. Bertrand? Okay, so if there's no further questions, and we will conclude this session. So once again, let's give a big round of applause to Mr. Bertrand for his very insightful sharing. Thank you so much.